Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Friendship Development for Autistic Youth, Lessons from the UCLA Peers Clinic. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. To the right of your screen is the control panel. As an attendee, you have the option of listening in using your computer or by phone. To switch from computer audio to phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and follow the dial-in instructions. If you're having trouble hearing me, please send a message through the questions pane and we will assist you. For today's session, we shared some materials in the handouts pane. You can download these materials at any time. At the end of today's event, you will receive a certificate of attendance via email. Since your mic is muted by default, you can submit questions or comments to our presenter by typing them into the questions pane at any time. We will hold off answering any questions until the end of the presentation. Since most of you are now here, let's get started. To those of you who have just joined us, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Friendship Development for Autistic Youth, Lessons from the UCLA Peers Clinic. My name is Clara and I'm your host for today's event. It's great to have you all here today. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Laugeson. Dr. Elizabeth Laugeson is a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at the UCLA Simmel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and is a licensed clinical psychologist. She is also the founder and director of the UCLA Peers Clinic, the director of the UCLA Tarjan Center, and the program director for the pre-doctoral psychology internship program in autism and neurodevelopmental disabilities at UCLA. Dr. Laugeson has trained tens of thousands of mental health professionals, educators, and families worldwide. She is dedicated to developing and testing evidence-based treatments to improve social skills across the lifespan and across the globe. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, well, thank you so much for that nice introduction, Clara, and a big thank you to you, to Kate, to Vivian, and everyone at the Organization for Autism Research for this kind invitation to present to your group. So as Clara mentioned, I'm going to be sharing a bit today about some evidence-based interventions that I've developed to help autistic youth with making and keeping friends, handling conflict and rejection, including things like bullying, and want to give you some concrete tools today to help you if that's something that's of interest to you. Before I get started, I wanted to just mention that I do receive book royalties for the sales of my books from Taylor and Francis and Wiley and Sons, and I also receive research funding from the National Institutes of Health, from the Administration for Community Living, and also from Autism Speaks. In terms of what I was hoping to go over with you today, I wanted to begin with just talking about what are some of the common social challenges that a lot of autistic youth struggle with, particularly related to making and keeping friends. I'll also talk about some of the consequences of peer rejection and give you a little brief overview of the peers intervention, which is really one of the only evidence-based social skills interventions for adolescents and adults on the autism spectrum that specifically focuses on friendship skills. I'll actually give you a little snapshot of a couple of skills that we teach in the program, particularly related to starting conversations, which is how we meet new people, and also how to handle teasing, which is probably the most common form of bullying. From there, I'll give you a little overview of some of the research that we've done in our program so that you can get a sense of what the outcomes look like. And then I'll wrap things up with giving you some resources to think about and utilize moving forward. All right, so what are some of the common social challenges that we see among autistic youth? Well, we know that poor social communication is kind of this hallmark feature among autistic individuals, but what does that look like? Well, for a lot of our young people, that might include difficulty with things like topic initiation, which is basically knowing what to talk about. And, because a lot of our young people have sort of very specialized interests, they'll often sort of focus on those interests when talking with others, but maybe with a little, disregard for whether or not it's interesting to the other person. And so it's not that they can't talk about these topics, of course, but we also have to make sure that who we're talking to, we got to know our audience and make sure that they're also interested in these topics. If we're going to work on developing any kind of a friendship or relationship with this person. And so what ends up happening, unfortunately, for a lot of young people on the spectrum is that they might have these sort of repetitive themes and conversations, maybe even have these one-sided conversations. And in the process, what's happening is they're failing to identify common interests. And the reason that common interests are so important is that friendships are often based on common interests, right? Think about who you're friends with or who you've been friends with. You probably have things in common. And those are the things that you talk about with your friends, and those are the things that you do with your friends. So if our goal, our social goal, is to make and keep friends, then in terms of our conversations, we need to always be looking for common interests, trying to find those common interests. We also know that a lot of young people on the spectrum struggle with poor social awareness. So this can involve difficulty understanding social cues and really kind of navigating the social world that we live in. And so one of our jobs, if we're going to be helping young people learn to make and keep friends, is we need to try to decode the social world a bit and help to pick up on some of those social cues. For example, a lot of people, when you ask them, how can you tell if someone wants to talk to you, they'll often say, oh, it's a feeling that you get. Well, not everybody gets that feeling. And so instead of relying on feelings, we should really decode what are the behaviors that are giving us the feeling, and then we can teach that. We also know that a lot of our young people really struggle with social engagement. They tend to have less constructive social engagement. So that might mean that they're less involved in social activities where they might make new friends. They might have fewer get-togethers with their friends. They might not be as engaged socially. Or if they are attempting to engage, they might be rather intrusive, maybe in entering conversations or something that's not really working for them. So we have to teach strategies to promote, successful peer engagement if we're going to be working on friendships. We also know that another hallmark feature among autistic individuals can sometimes relate to poor social cognition. And social cognition is just the technical term for perspective taking, right? It's putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and being able to anticipate how they might think or feel or react in a given situation. And so this is also something that we need to target if we're going to be working on friendship development. And then finally, bottom line, for a lot of autistic youth, they really struggle with close, meaningful friendships. And if you ask most people on the spectrum if they have friends, many will say yes. But then when you investigate further, the quality of those friendships sometimes doesn't go as deep. And sadly, one of the results of that is a lot of feelings of loneliness and isolation, sadly. So there are many consequences of peer rejection, whether you're autistic or not. One of the things that we found is that during adolescence, peer rejection is one of the strongest predictors of mental health problems later in life. So what that means is if you want to predict who's going to be depressed or anxious later in life, go into any typical middle school or high school, at least in North America, and look for the kids who are being rejected. And that's going to be one of the strongest predictors of those mental health issues. We also know that peer rejection is very much related to feelings of loneliness and isolation, poor self-esteem, even poor academic performance and early withdrawal from school, very much related to peer rejection, as well as things like substance abuse and juvenile delinquency, and even at its worst, suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, very strongly related to peer rejection. And it's not just autistic youth that are struggling with this. The skills that we teach in peers are not just appropriate for autistic youth, they're really appropriate for anybody who wants to learn how to make and keep friends, and anyone who's sort of struggling with this type of peer rejection. So, up until recently, there were very few programs that were really focused on helping to enhance social relationships for autistic adolescents and adults. And when I started doing this research back in 2004, there really were no programs for adolescents and adults. And that's really what led me to develop the peers intervention. It started as an adolescent program that was parent assisted. So parents were going through the program in tandem with their kids, and they were learning how to be good social coaches to their kids. That actually led into a school-based intervention. We discovered that, as much as we wanted to include parents, not all parents were willing or able to participate in the program. And we knew a lot of schools were providing social skills interventions in the classroom, but the research was suggesting that these programs weren't very effective. And so we thought, okay, well, we'll take this curriculum and we'll modify it for the school setting. So we also have a publicly available school-based intervention for adolescents in middle school and high school. Shortly, not long thereafter, we discovered too, a lot of the skills that we were teaching to adolescents were very applicable to adults as well. And at that point, there were no evidence-based social skills interventions for autistic adults. And so that led to the Peers for Young Adults program. And fast forward now, this all started back in 2004 at UCLA when I started to develop these programs. Now, 2023, the program has been translated into over a dozen languages. It's been translated across the globe and also culturally adapted across the globe, and it's used in over 150 countries. So really, really widely disseminated program, one of the few that's actually got any research support behind it. In addition to these programs, we also have a preschool program that will be publicly available in the coming year, as well as some research programs that I'm happy to share a little bit more about later related to employment and also dating. What makes the Peers program sort of unique from other social skills programs that might be publicly available is, as I mentioned, it's one of the only evidence-based or empirically supported programs. Unfortunately, the research suggests that most social skills interventions aren't very effective. And a lot of people will ask why. There's many reasons why. One of the reasons I think that most programs out there that are kind of publicly available maybe aren't always as effective is that they're not always teaching what are called ecologically valid social skills. And so that's just the technical term for what works in reality, right? And so often a lot of programs might be teaching what adults think that kids should do in social situations rather than what works in reality. And so instead of relying on ourselves to figure out what's appropriate in social situations, we use research to tell us, well, what do people who've been successful at making friends do? And then we teach that. And that's an ecologically valid skill. And it's not always intuitive. And you're going to see that as we go through some of the material. Another unique aspect of Peers is that we have parent-assisted or caregiver-assisted programs. So we're not just working with the adolescents and the young adults or preschoolers, whoever it happens to be on the spectrum. We're also working with their family members and caregivers, people that can provide support and really social coaching out in the real world. And this is important because these are time-limited programs. Most of our programs are only 16 weeks in length. They come once a week for 90 minutes. That's not a lot of time in the grand scheme of life, right? So we want to train others who can provide that support. And that way we're going to have a much more durable program. It's going to generalize out into the real world. And it's sort of like the program never ends if you include these caregivers and often parents. And then finally, another unique aspect of Peers is that this is one of the few cross-culturally validated programs, meaning that we've done research across the globe. And you can see some of the manuals that are published outside of the US and other languages other than English. This is not all of them, but again, that's sort of a unique aspect. We always do research on these programs in other languages and other cultures before we publicly share them and disseminate them. Okay, so that's a little background about Peers. Now I just want to share you a little bit about the skills we teach, and then we'll dive into a couple of the strategies that we teach. So really our programs, at least for adolescents and adults, kind of focus on two domains. One is the friendship skills, and also romantic relationship skills in our young adult program. And then we also focus on things like handling conflict and rejection. So with regard to friendships and romantic relationships, that would include things like, finding and choosing appropriate friends or romantic partners. Conversational skills are really big. Knowing how to start conversations enter conversations and also exit conversations is really important as we're trying to meet new people. In order to strengthen these new friendships, we also have to know how to organize and have successful get-togethers with friends outside of whatever social activities, school, or work settings we're in. That's how we develop close, meaningful friendships with people, is hanging out with them outside of organized activities. We also have to work on things like good sportsmanship, right? Some of our young people have maybe not the best reputations with their peers, and we don't want that to get in the way of their ability to make and keep friends. So we might have to work on changing those reputations. And then we also teach strategies related to dating etiquette in our young adult program. So that would be things like letting somebody know that you like them, flirting, asking someone on a date, just kind of general dating do's and don'ts. And there is actually research that teaches people how to flirt and how to ask someone on a date. And it's all ecologically valid. We're not relying on ourselves to teach these skills. We're relying on the research. Now, related to the managing conflict and rejection skills, that includes things, related to dating etiquette. That would be things like taking no for an answer, or politely turning someone down, or handling unwanted dating pressure, maybe from a partner. Related to friendships, though, it could be things like handling arguments and disagreements, as well as changing that reputation if we need to, and then also handling the different forms of bullying. And research tells us that there's essentially 4 types of bullying. There's verbal bullying, which is things like teasing and name calling. There's physical bullying, which is typically more aggressive, maybe physical kinds of bullying like hitting or kicking, pushing, but it also can involve things like pranking and practical jokes, maybe manipulating someone or stealing from someone. And those are direct forms of bullying, but there's also indirect forms of bullying, and that would include things like cyberbullying and also things like rumors and gossip. Those are 4 very different types of behaviors, and not surprising, we have totally different strategies for handling all 4 types of bullying. So really important to be thinking about the importance of those types of social skills. Now, I also want to mention before we get into the material that there really is an emphasis that we place in our program on intrinsic social motivation. And what that means is that the people that we're working with in our program, they need to want to be there. In fact, they have to want to be there for us to teach them these skills. I really believe that social skills training, if you will, needs to be voluntary. I don't think that it's really ethical to force social skills on to people who don't want to learn them. In fact, it's not even going to work really if they don't want to be there. You get these things like I call it the too cool for school syndrome, where they're just kind of got their arms folded, they don't want to be there, they say this is stupid, everybody knows this, and they're not going to benefit from the program. But really, there's also a danger in including young people that don't want to be there, in the sense that it might start to feel a little bit unsafe for the people who do want to be there, right? Because if there's someone who's just sort of saying, this is stupid, everybody knows this, it doesn't make it feel safe for the people who do want to learn the skills. So those are some reasons maybe not to include people who don't want to be there. But I would also say just ethically, it doesn't feel right to force social skills training onto someone who doesn't want to learn the skills. However, you probably heard that argument before. I would also argue too that it's not ethical to withhold this type of treatment or intervention for people who do want to learn the skills. So that's very, very important. And that really kind of gets us to the role of neurodiversity. Right, so neurodiversity essentially is that people experience the world and interact with the world in different ways. And really that there's not necessarily one right or wrong way of doing things, like thinking or feeling, behaving, learning. It's just different. So the skills that we teach in peers really aren't about so much like this is the only way to do this thing. It's more about what research tells us has been effective for people, like what more commonly is effective in these social situations. And then people can choose whether or not they use those skills or not. And that's a really important point too, is that the skills that we teach in peers are still a choice, right? For example, I teach social skills for a living, right? That doesn't mean I always have good social skills. You know, most days, hopefully I'm okay. But some days, maybe my social skills aren't so great, and that's my choice. Maybe I'm a little grumpy that day or something. There's different reasons, but it's always a choice whether or not you're choosing to use these social skills. The same thing is true for learning or using these skills. You need to make sure that it's always something that is a choice. And I would just kind of, wrap this thought up with saying that, learning or using the skills that we teach in peers isn't about changing the person, right? It's really just about enhancing their social interactions with other people so that people can appreciate them for who they already are. And that kind of relates to, arguments about things like masking and camouflaging. Is social skills training masking and camouflaging? I mean, it depends on, how you look at it, right? And in terms of using these skills, if it's a choice, then it shouldn't really be masking. Like, I choose to use social skills or not. So we can talk a little bit more about how that looks, and plays out in the real world, but it should always be a choice. And when I'm choosing to use good social skills, I don't feel like it's changing me as a person. It's just my choice to do that or not. All right, so in moving on, I just want to also open this up to the audience to discuss a bit more, because I do think it's important before we get into the content to think about this. So some autistic self-advocates are openly opposed to social skills training because they might believe that, it teaches masking or camouflaging. So I guess I'd like to ask the audience here, if you wouldn't mind writing your answers in the question pane of the meeting. Why would it be important to confirm the social motivation and intrinsic desire to learn these ecologically valid social skills when you're determining if the treatment is a good fit for the person who's presenting for treatment? And also, what could be the harm in including people who really don't want to be there and don't want to learn these skills? So if you don't mind putting your answers in the question pane, and I believe Clara is going to help to read out your responses.
Absolutely. We'll just give people a few seconds to get their responses in, and I'll let you know as soon as I see something. All right, I see the first response. Those who don't want to be there could influence the participation attitude of those who do want to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that happens all the time. I call it the too cool for school syndrome, where it's like this negative contagion where now everybody doesn't want to be there because this one person didn't want to be there. So that's a big risk in including someone who doesn't want to learn the skills. And also, that person's not going to benefit if they don't want to be there. Yeah, good point.
Okay. And another person says, I fully understand why people are concerned about teaching skills that are really just encouraging masking. I am more interested in them understanding consent and how to handle no.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the consent and understanding no is very important in any kind of social dynamics. And I also think the idea of masking and camouflaging, I think it's worth kind of thinking about what that means, because I have a lot of people that will say, well, don't we all kind of mask and camouflage? And I've given that a lot of thought. And the example that sometimes comes to mind for me is related to things like cursing, right? Like swearing, using bad language, right? I have this one friend, close friend of mine, and work colleague who, I'm not going to out her, but like curses like a sailor outside of work. And in the work setting, she doesn't do that. And I kind of talked about it with her one time in the context of camouflaging. And she's like, well, of course, Liz, of course I'm not going to, swear at work and curse like a sailor. I want to keep my job, right? But that's not changing who she is as a person, but it is a choice. We sometimes alter our social behavior to sort of fit with whatever the social setting is. We all do that, right? You probably all have done that on Zoom calls before. This is the one that kind of resonates with me a bit more, where I'm on a Zoom call and, maybe I'm having a really rough day and I'm a little bit stressed out. I might be hungry, or I might need, something some caffeine, but I need to stay focused. and pay attention to what's going on in the Zoom call. And Zoom calls can be exhausting, right? I mean, there's actually research that shows that it's physically exhausting because you're having to maintain all this attention and really stay focused when really maybe you don't feel like doing that, but you kind of fake it. You sort of look like you do. Is that masking? Is that camouflaging? I mean, probably, if you think about it, but is it changing who I am as a person? It doesn't feel like that to me. If it feels like that to someone though, then they shouldn't do it, right? I mean, that's the choice part. That's the big important part of this, is that it really needs to be a choice. But we all sort of alter our behavior in certain social settings for the comfort of others. And again, it's a choice. Do we have any other questions or responses in the chat?
We have had so many responses. I couldn't possibly read them all, but here's another one. You are teaching skills that can help them, but you aren't teaching them not to be themselves. I guess that's why I don't think it's really masking or camouflaging. But then we are all different people in different settings sometimes.
Yeah, it's true for all. I mean, if you really think about it, we all are kind of, you wear different hats. You hear that expression sometimes. I try to wear the same hat as much as possible. Like that's my life goal, is to be like my most authentic self in every situation. But sometimes I'm a little different, based on where I am. And there's certain things I wouldn't do or say with people maybe I don't know as well. We all do that. Is that masking or camouflaging? Probably, but as long as it doesn't make me feel like I'm not being myself, I'm okay with that. And it really does need to be a choice. And thank you for the comment of that we're not trying to teach people to be something that they're not. And that goes to the point when we talk about finding a source of friends or romantic partners. It's so much, if friendships are based on common interests, then finding other people with common interests is going to be key, right, to developing these friendships and relationships. And so finding social activities based on their interests, not trying to get a kid who's maybe obsessed with video games to stop playing video games. I'm not trying to do that ever. I want that kid to find other kids who love video games and want to talk about video games and play video games. And so it's about really trying to find other people who can appreciate us for who we already are, and also interact with those individuals in a way that's not going to push them away, right? And that's sort of what we're going to do by kind of decoding the social world. So thank you for your responses, and I appreciate the thoughtful comments, and thanks to Clara for helping to moderate that. That's going to segue us into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is one of the skills that we teach in peers. So you can get a glimpse, a little snapshot of how we teach skills. And I will open it up to the question pane again, because I want to ask this question. I want to hear what you guys have to say. A lot of young people are told to do this certain thing to meet new people. Like, imagine it's the first day of school. I haven't met anyone. What am I told to go up and do to meet new people? And as we're waiting for you to write those responses, this is going to be an example of where really well-intentioned adults will sometimes give inappropriate social advice. And they'll often tell kids to do things that are not ecologically valid, that those adults themselves probably wouldn't even do. So again, what are a lot of kids told to do to meet new people? Are you seeing any responses?
I'm seeing a lot of responses, and a lot of people are saying introduce yourself.
Yep.
I'm also saying shake hands and give eye contact.
Mm-hmm. There's one other one I hear a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's go up and say, are you seeing any of that? Go up and say hi.
Go up and say hi, yes.
Yeah. So those are the most common responses I get when I ask that question. I ask kids that question all the time, and they say they're told to either go up and introduce themselves, go up and say hi. Sometimes they're told to shake hands. But have you ever thought about what that would look like? Like, imagine that this kid just walks up to a group of kids at school and says, hi, I'm Liz or something. What would the group think of them? That's kind of weird. It's unusual. People don't just walk up and say hi and introduce themselves. It's, there's usually a reason. There's like a context for us to be talking to people that we don't know. And so we don't want to teach the inappropriate ways of starting conversations with people, even though that's what a lot of programs do. They teach kids to go up and say hi and introduce themselves. That actually might push people away ultimately, because it isn't actually ecologically valid. Another common social error, though, that we see is going to be represented in this role play that we're going to see in a moment. And so in peers, we do a lot of role plays where we demonstrate skills. Then we show both appropriate and inappropriate examples of these skills. And some people question, like, well, why do you show inappropriate examples? Well, because that's the common social error that people make. They need to see what that looks like. And so we need to talk about why that wouldn't be an appropriate thing to do before we get into the actual ecologically valid strategies. So in this role play that you're about to see, we're going to see a person by the name of Alina. She's going to be coming into the screen from the right side. And I want you to watch to see what Alina does wrong in starting this conversation.
Hey, do you ever go roller skating?
What?
Do you go roller skating?
No.
Why not? You should go.
Okay.
It's really fun. I go like every weekend.
Sweet.
There's this new skate park that just opened up.
I'm trying to watch something right now, so.
Oh, well, I'm just saying. It's really fun. They have like a student night every Thursday.
Cool.
You should definitely go.
Okay.
All right, so what did Alina do wrong there? Well, she just randomly walked up to this person and started talking about roller skating. And there was no context for doing that, right? They weren't in a roller skating rink. The person wasn't carrying roller skates with them. They didn't have a roller skate on their t-shirt, right? They were on their iPhone and they were watching a music video. So why are we talking about roller skating? So that's not exactly ecologically valid, right? That's actually something that could result in a lot of rejection if we keep doing these things. So we have to now think about the social cognition piece of this, right? So get into the mind of the other person. What was that like for the other person when Alina was, randomly talking about roller skating when she was trying to watch a video on her phone? Well, it was probably kind of annoying, sort of frustrating. She looked frustrated, right? And what did she think of Alina? Well, she probably thought she was kind of annoying or obnoxious, maybe a little bit weird, right? And would she want to talk to her again? Probably not, right? I mean, she just kind of annoyed her. This is actually how people can get bad reputations amongst their peers for doing that repeatedly. So instead of that, what we want to do is we want to teach the skills that are actually more likely to lead to social success. And this is not something that most of us would intuitively know to tell kids to do. But if you look at the research, this is actually what socially successful people will often naturally do. Some of you might even naturally do this and you never even thought about it. So the first thing that you're doing is you're kind of casually looking over at the person and you're sort of noticing, what they're doing or maybe where you are, and you're not staring at them because that could feel a little creepy, right? So usually people are using a prop, like a phone is really common, just kind of look like you're looking at text messages or something. Maybe it's a gaming device or reading material, but you're looking distracted. And really what you're trying to do is you're trying to find a common interest. And the reason that common interests are important is, remember, those are the foundations of friendships, right? It's what we talk about. It's what we do with our friends. So you're just looking for some kind of common interest. And that's really going to be sort of like your cover story or your excuse for talking to this person. Once you've found that common interest, you're going to mention it. And you can do that in one of three ways. You can either make a comment, you can ask a question, or you can give a compliment. Right, so in that example we saw Jordan was the person that Alina was trying to talk to. Jordan was on her iPhone and she was watching a music video, right? So what could she make a comment about? She could say, oh, that's the new such and such video, right? What would be a question? Oh, is that the new such and such video? Or what would be a compliment? I love that song. These are all ways to sort of start talking to the person. You got some reason, some cover story, if you will, for talking to them. And that's a common interest. Then what we do from there is we start to do this thing we call trading information. Trading information is the buzzword we use for having a good reciprocal two-way conversation. And there are dozens of rules related to having good reciprocal two-way conversations, but they will have learned that already about how to have that two-way conversation. And that's part of this process, is to go back and forth. We're not just going to talk at the person or just ask question after question. Now we have to start assessing the person's interest. Does it seem like they want to talk to us? Well, remember earlier I said that sometimes when you ask people that question, how do you know when someone wants to talk to you? A lot of people will say it's a feeling that you get, but not everybody gets the feeling. And if you do get the feeling, it's because you're picking up on concrete behaviors that give you the feeling, right? So what would they be doing with their eyes if they want to talk to you? Well, they'd probably be looking at you, right, and not rolling their eyes or making a face. What would they be doing with their body? They'd be facing you, right, not turned away, giving you the cold shoulder, and they would actually be talking to you and not giving rude replies or remarks. And those are the three behavioral signs that tell us if somebody wants to talk to us. Are they looking at us? Are they facing us? Are they talking to us? If things are going well and it seems like they want to talk to us and we've never met them before, then we can introduce ourselves. And how do you do that? Oh, by the way, I don't think we've met before. I'm Liz, something like that. But the introductions are always optional. And if they happen, they come later. All right, so next step in the formula for teaching this particular skill is to show an appropriate role play following these steps. And so we're going to do that now. And I want you to watch this role play and think about which steps Alina's following for starting this conversation.
Oh my God, I love that song.
Yeah, me too. This is the new video that just came out today.
No way, I'm dying to see that.
Yeah, it's so good.
That's awesome. Have you ever seen her in concert?
I have. I actually have tickets for her upcoming concert.
No way, the one that's coming up in 2 weeks?
Yeah, it's going to be so great.
That's so cool.
Have you ever seen her perform?
No, I wish. I really want to.
Oh my gosh, she's amazing in concert. You need to see her.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I'm Alina.
I'm Jordan.
Nice to meet you.
All right, so a little different, right? So again, we would time out. We'd ask, what did Alina do right there? And they would say, you know, she followed all these steps. We'd go through the steps again and then do some perspective taking. What was that like for Jordan this time? It was comfortable. It was natural, right? What did she think of Alina this time? She thought she was friendly, right? She was nice. And would she want to talk to her again? Yeah, I mean, this is how friendships start to develop, right? Is by starting conversations with people or entering group conversations. It's not even just enough to show up at school or work, right? You have to know how to interact with people. It's not just enough to show up to an extracurricular activity where you know that everyone has a common interest. That's a great start, because extracurricular activities, social activities, if we're choosing them based on our interest, that's wonderful because it's a ready-made pool of people that we already have things in common with. But it's still not a guarantee of a friendship. We still have to make sure that we have something to talk about, and we need to know how to do that. All right, so I don't see my slides right now, so I don't know if we can go ahead and have those pulled up. Thank you. All right, so I have another question for all of you. So go ahead and feel free to use your audience question pane. Well-intentioned adults, as I mentioned, will often give inappropriate advice to young people in social situations. The things like go up and say hi, right? Go up and introduce yourself. What are the dangers, actually, of teaching inappropriate social skills to youth who are struggling socially? We haven't talked about that yet. That's actually a little dangerous. Why is that? And also, why is it important to only focus on using and teaching ecologically valid social skills in these types of interventions?
Our first response came in, people will make fun of them more.
Yeah.
It can cause a bad impression, further rejection and bullying. It might make it even harder to make friends.
Definitely.
And they might feel more isolated than they already are.
Yeah, I mean, this is so sad, right? These are well-intentioned adults and practitioners, educators, giving sort of inappropriate advice and not even knowing they're doing it, right? They might not even do those things. And so what ends up happening is that kids go out and try these skills, go up and say hi, introduce themselves, they realize it doesn't work, and now they're feeling even more anxious and also more rejected, and might even lead to more rejection in the future, related to having a bad reputation for doing these odd things. Again, it's very unintentional, but it's really important. And it's why we need to focus on teaching ecologically valid social skills. And we don't know what those are without doing research, right? Because you could have really good social skills, but that doesn't mean you know how to teach good social skills, right? Because so much of what we do becomes automatic for many of us. Doesn't come automatic for a lot of our neurodivergent kids, but for some of us it does come automatic, but you don't even think about what you're doing. So it's really easy to give inappropriate advice in these situations. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I want to teach you one more skill. This one relates to handling conflict and rejection, and specifically what we're going to focus on here is how to handle teasing. Of all the different forms of bullying, teasing is probably the most common. And this is, again, where really well-intentioned adults give horrible advice regards to teasing rather. So let's go ahead and open it up to the audience question pane. And I want you guys to tell me, what do you think most adults will tell kids to do in response to teasing? And I typically hear like 3 main responses over and over that kids are told to do.
The first one's in, and it's ignore it.
Yep.
Seeing a lot of ignore it, tell someone,
Uh-huh.
walk away.
Yep. Those are the 3. You guys got it within like 5 seconds. You got it. I ask every group of kids that I work with that same question. They always say they're told to ignore, walk away, or tell an adult. Then I ask them if it works. Guess what they say? Not usually, right? Because guess what? None of those things are ecologically valid. So think about this. Imagine someone's teasing me and I ignore them. What will they do? They're going to keep teasing me, right? Because I made it easy for them. And because I made it so easy, am I more or less likely to be teased by that person? I'm more likely, right? If I walk away, what will they do? They'll follow me, right? And keep teasing me. And again, I didn't do anything. I made it so easy for them. I'm more likely to be teased in that situation. And if I go tell someone, I go tell a teacher, now they want to retaliate against me because I tried to get them in trouble. I'm more likely to get teased, right? And you also have to think about, what does the teaser want you to do? Well, they want you to get upset, right? They want you to get mad or sad or even try to tease back, and that's fun for them. So if you get into the mind of the teaser, you can't do what they want you to do, or you're more likely to get teased. So instead, what we need to do is teach what is ecologically valid, right? You sound like a broken record, but it's so important, right? So you look at research of what do kids who are able to escape teasing do. They do something that is so simple. I would say it's the easiest skill we teach in peers. All they do is they give this very short comeback that shows that what the other person said didn't bother them. And actually what they said was kind of stupid, right? And it's very short, and it's something like, whatever, or yeah, and, or am I supposed to care? Is that supposed to be funny? So what? Big deal, who cares? Anyway, they'll roll their eyes, they'll shrug their shoulders, and it gives the impression that it didn't bother them, it was kind of stupid, and it embarrasses the teaser because it looks like what they said, was irrelevant. That is an ecologically valid skill. That is what we need to teach when we're helping kids to handle teasing, right? Think about the negative impact on mental health that comes from things like peer rejection and teasing. These are really depressed, anxious kids and adults. People remember these stories of being teased and bullied as a kid. It doesn't have to be like that. We just have to give them the right tools. And it's not just autistic youth. Every kid needs to learn how to do this, right? And by the way, you don't have to stand there and keep taking it. After you've given a couple or a few comebacks, then you can walk away or turn away or start talking to someone else. That is an ecologically valid skill. All right, so let's see what this is supposed to look like. Now, this is an example where we would not do an inappropriate example first, because honestly, that would be very emotionally triggering for a lot of our young people. So instead, we just show the appropriate example here. So in this video, you're going to see Gabe, and Gabe is being teased. I want you to watch to see what Gabe does right here in handling this teasing.
Hey dweeb, reading again?
Whatever.
You're such a loser. You're always reading.
Am I supposed to care?
Yeah, because everyone thinks you're a loser.
Anyway.
All right, so what did Gabe do right? Well, he just gave the impression that what the person said didn't bother him and what he said was kind of stupid, right? So think about that. Get into the mind of the teaser. What was that like for the teaser? Not very gratifying, right? Not what he expected. And what did that teaser think of Gabe? Wasn't really bothered, right? And would he want to tease Gabe again? I mean, probably not, right? That's not really the reaction he's looking for. So again, really simple skill. You don't have to be neurodivergent or autistic to learn this skill. I personally think every kid should have to learn this skill. I mean, this is such an important like life lesson to have. Every kid gets teased. It doesn't matter how popular you are. Every kid gets teased. It's how you react to it that determines how significantly, how chronically or severely you're teased. All right, so that gives you a little snapshot of some of the skills that we teach in peers. I also wanted to give you a little snapshot too of some of the research findings to give you a sense of, what are the outcomes like in this program? And there's been over 50 peer-reviewed papers alone on peers. And it's not just at UCLA where I work, but there's been a lot of independent replication of our research. One of the studies I wanted to share with you is not a study that I was affiliated with. It's a meta-analysis of peers that was done by a group up at UC San Francisco. And they looked at all these different peers programs. These are peers for adolescent programs for autistic youth. And they kind of looked at all of the findings in aggregate. Now, just to kind of explain the methodology here. So they started with over 1,300 papers that were focused on social skills training for autistic youth. And they narrowed it down to about a dozen papers that really were, they were empirical articles that were focused on using the peers for adolescents intervention with autistic youth that had some kind of pre-post comparison group design using the outcomes that they were interested in the study. And they looked at effect sizes. So what you need to know about that is effect sizes tell you how meaningful a relationship is between variables. And a large effect size is 0.8 or larger. And that tells you that the research findings have some kind of practical significance. A small effect size is 0.2 or less. That doesn't have a lot of practical significance. And then anything kind of in the middle would be kind of like a medium effect size, around 0.5. Okay, so the first thing they looked at in this meta-analysis was social skills knowledge. Were kids learning skills related to making and keeping friends in these various peers programs? And what they found were large effect sizes across these various studies. So it's a very powerful outcome, something that you can definitely expect. They're going to learn the skills that we're teaching them in peers. It looks like they even go up to like 3.85 effect sizes. They're really, really high. They also wanted to look at overall social skills, which is usually by parent report. It's on a measure called the Social Skills Improvement System. It's a standardized measure. And they also saw in this, across the different studies, medium to large effect sizes in improvements in overall social skills following peers. Additionally, they wanted to look at social responsiveness. Now, this is using a measure called the Social Responsiveness Scale. It's historically been used as kind of like an autism screening questionnaire. And here we also see medium to large effect sizes across these various studies. And so really nice improvements in this measure that really was normed on autistic individuals. We also, in this study, they wanted to look at social engagement. This is something that we frequently look at in peers studies. And so this is like the frequency of get-togethers with people in the previous month. And they looked at kind of a pre-post comparison. This is self-report. So these are the adolescents reporting. And here we see more variability. We see all the way from small to large effect sizes. What's interesting about this is that if you look at the studies that had small effect sizes here kind of at the bottom of the screen, the Rabin, the Schum, the U papers, those all took place outside of the US in cultures where having get-togethers with friends outside of school or work was kind of uncommon, right? So the Schum paper took place in Hong Kong. Community-based or even home-based get-togethers not as common in Hong Kong. The Rabin paper was in Israel. again, not as common, and the U paper was in South Korea. So some of that is a cultural variation as well as just, based on the research findings. Culturally, it's kind of different in these areas of the world. Same thing for the parent report on the social engagement scale. Again, small to large effect sizes, and again, much of that is related to what's socially appropriate in that culture. The last study that I wanted to share with you, as promising as the meta-analysis is life changed a lot during COVID-19. We had to move all of our programs to telehealth. And, of course, we wanted to start to right away investigate, how effective was that? And so in terms of how we modified things for telehealth versus in-person groups, all of our telehealth groups were conducted over Zoom. We had some modified lessons based on online social skills. We had video role plays in our telehealth versus live role plays in the in-person groups. We still practiced all the skills, but over Zoom that happened in virtual breakout groups versus, in live and in person. And then we also added some additional homework assignments to have in-group get-togethers, which is where group members were actually having online get-togethers with other group members, where normally we wouldn't allow in-group fraternization during the program. And that was really just because a lot of our kids were kind of socially isolated during COVID. We wanted to give them an opportunity to practice the skills. Now, the first thing we wanted to look at was telehealth even effective? So this is looking at the social responsiveness scale, and this scale uses what are called T-scores that have a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10, and you see almost a full standard deviation improvement from pre to post test. So what that means is that because this is sort of like an autism screening tool and it relates to social responsiveness, higher scores indicate greater impairment in social responsiveness. So you want those scores to go down, and they did statistically, significantly so. We also saw nice improvements in social skills knowledge. That also improved with telehealth. We looked at also things like general overall social skills and also saw very nice improvements there. This is the social skills improvement system that uses standard scores with a mean or an average of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. And we're seeing about a 10-point standard score improvement. That's not just statistically significant, that's clinically meaningful. They're going from the below average range of social skills to the more average range using telehealth delivery. And we also saw nice improvements in things like problem behaviors. Those also went down through telehealth delivery, as did social engagement. We saw a significant increase according to teens and the number of get-togethers they were having, and parents were also corroborating that. So the next part of the study was to look at, well, what was the difference between telehealth versus in-person? And so the blue line here represents the telehealth change in outcomes, and the yellow is the in-person groups. And this is the social responsiveness scale where, again, we want the scores to go down, and they're perfectly in line with one another. There's no differences between telehealth and in-person. Same thing is true for social skills knowledge. They're learning the skills at the same rate in both telehealth and in person, no statistically significant differences. Same is true with learning a kind of general overall social skills and improving in their social interactions with others. That is also consistent across both groups, no differences there. And the same is true with problem behaviors. The one area where you start to see a little bit of a difference, but it's not statistically significant, is in the number of get-togethers they're having. In general, telehealth is slightly outperforming in person, but you have to remember too, they had those additional homework assignments to have the in-group get-together with other group members. So that would explain the difference, but it's still not statistically significant between in-person and telehealth with both teen report and parent report. So hopefully that gives you a little glimpse of what our outcomes typically look like in our programs. Just to finally wrap things up before we get into our Q&A, I want to share with you that we're doing ongoing research around other programs. I'm always developing new programs, and the most recent is Peers for Careers, which is a college to career transition program for autistic adults. And it's a 20 peer mediated, where we have peer career coaches that assist the young adults as they're kind of looking to obtain and maintain employment. We're also working with employers to create a more supportive work environment to help with retention and employment. We also have Peers for Dating, which is what it sounds like. It's a program for autistic adults that teaches skills related to developing and maintaining romantic relationships. And again, in this study, we are using a peer-mediated model where we have dating coaches. These are people around the same age as the young adult that are just interested in supporting their interest in developing and maintaining romantic relationships. We also are doing a study using the drug L-DOPA in combination with peers. And if you're familiar with the drug L-DOPA, it's typically used for Parkinson's patients, and it increases the amount of dopamine in the brain. And if you know anything about dopamine, that's kind of like the feel-good neurochemical, right? The one that makes you feel like rewards and feelings of pleasure. And the idea here is if we increase the amount of dopamine in the brain, could we make socialization more rewarding? So that's another study that we're doing with autistic teens and adults. In terms of our clinical services, we have weekly groups that we run both in person and online for adults, and that's something that's ongoing throughout the year at UCLA. There's also programs all over the globe that you can look into. You don't have to come to UCLA for this program, but that is something that we're very dedicated to. We also have clinical groups that are not research related for adolescents in middle school and high school. These are all parent or caregiver assisted programs, both in person and telehealth options. And that's also true for Peers for Preschoolers, which is our program for 4 to 6-year-old children. And I should mention that in all of these clinical programs, even though a lot of my research focuses on autistic youth, our clinical programs are open to anybody who wants to learn the skills. So there's a lot of people in our programs that are not neurodivergent, they're just struggling socially. And it's still very relevant to them because these are just good, ecologically valid social skills. They apply to anybody who wants to learn them. And so we have both remote options as well as in-person options for Peers for Preschoolers, as well as these educational classes that we have that are available worldwide. And these are actually for adolescents and for adults. And we discovered during COVID that a lot of people wanted to access our programs because they could over Zoom. And so we created these educational programs and also created additionally some dating content related to that. This is the flyers for Peers for Preschoolers. Again, we have telehealth options for parent only, and then also in-person options with both children and parents. Finally, just some final resources for those that are interested in doing kind of more accelerated boot camps. We have these weekend boot camps that we do that are very topical. We have a conversation boot camp, a friendship boot camp, a bully proofing boot camp, and a dating boot camp that we offer throughout the summer months. They're offered on a Saturday and a Sunday from 9 to 3, and this is open to all families, really, anyone that wants to learn the skills, as well as professionals. We also have a virtual boot camp that's available on a YouTube channel if anyone wants to access the skills that we teach in Peers. Kind of go at your own pace, YouTube channel that never expires. That's kind of a nice option as well. We have a library of role play videos like the ones you saw here. There's over 100 role play videos in this library on the UCLA Peers Clinic website. You can access it using this QR code, and they're free. They're publicly available for anyone to take a look at. That's a nice resource that we like to provide for people. This is another resource I'm very proud of. It's relatively new. It's only been in existence for about a year. We have a free Peers app. It operates kind of like a video game where you can kind of go through different levels, but each level represents a different type of skill that we teach in Peers, and it's free for anyone. You can just access it on the in the App Store for both iOS and Android devices, and there's over 100 role play videos associated with this, and all of the content that we teach in Peers is actually in this app. It's also offered in multiple languages, not just in English. We also have a book called The Science of Making Friends for anyone who wants to learn about the skills that we teach in Peers but maybe can't access a Peers program. We also have this wonderful resource. I don't know if you've seen this show on Netflix called Love on the Spectrum, but it's an adorable, sweet sort of docu-drama series about adults on the spectrum looking for love. And if you check out the very first season of the Australian version, which is the original version of Love on the Spectrum, it features a dating boot camp that I did with the cast. And so if you want to learn more about these boot camps and what they look like, you can check out that show. But also it's just a very sweet show, and I would highly recommend it. For professionals in the audience, I should also mention for mental health professionals, educators, we do certified training seminars 5 times a year at UCLA via Zoom. So these are 3-day teleconferences. We have our parent-assisted teen program offered every November and April. We also have our young adult program offered every September and February. And then we also have our school-based program offered every June. So you're welcome to get in touch and learn more about these resources or our trainings. But with that, I will stop and go ahead and open things up for questions. But thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And so that concludes the presentation portion, and we'll now begin the Q&A session of today's webinar. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in your control panel. Because our time is limited, we may not be able to get through all of your questions. So if there are any questions that we aren't able to get to today, we will try to get back to you by email at a later time. Okay, our first question was from Erin, and that question is, in your research, what do teens who successfully generalize these skills long-term do compared to those who do not successfully continue to generalize?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. We have done long-term research on our programs, on our parent-assisted adolescent program for autistic youth, and we found that 1 to 5 years after going through this parent-assisted program, these teens are doing just as well, if not better, than where they ended at the end of the program. So related to things like overall social skills, social responsiveness, problem behaviors, social engagement, all of these areas that I shared with you earlier when we compared our in-person to telehealth, all of those areas not only maintained, but in some areas got better. And, a lot of people will ask, why is that? It's only a 16-week program. They only come for once a week, 90 minutes. This is not a lot of time in the grand scheme of things. And I would completely give this up to the parents. I think that the reason this program is continuing to do well long after they've left our class is because the program never ended. Because when you involve parents or caregivers in treatment, they can continue to provide that social coaching out in the real world. And so I really think the true power behind the Peers program is parent involvement or caregiver involvement or peer involvement. It's not just enough to go to a class, once a week for a few months. We need people to support us out in the real world. And that's an ongoing thing. It doesn't just end when the program ends. So thank you for the question.
Perfect. Thank you so much for responding. I think we have time for one more question here. And that question is from Joy. And the question is, this seems to like how to make friends with neurotypical peers rather than other neurodivergent peers. How would this be different for autistic kids meeting and interacting with other autistic kids?
Yeah, good question. I mean, honestly, it really is the same whether you're on the spectrum or not. I mean, if you were to if one autistic person were to walk up to another autistic person and do what Alina did with talking about roller skating, when this other person's on their phone doing something else, that's probably not going to be met with much acceptance, right? So really, when you look at what's ecologically valid for neurodivergent youth, it's not different really when they're successful at making and keeping friends. And we also don't tell them who to be friends with. I think that's also worth mentioning, that really we're just suggesting these are some of the things that have worked for people that have been successful at making and keeping friends. But we also we're not giving them the friends. And this is an important piece, is that another really critical component to this whole formula of making and keeping friends is finding a source of friends. Right? And a good source of friends is typically people that we have things in common with, right? That's why things like extracurricular activities, social activities, clubs, or even sports for some kids are so important in their friendship development, whether they're autistic or not, because that's where they find other people that like the same things. And remember, that's the foundation of a friendship, is of these common interests. So getting kids enrolled in gaming clubs if they're into gaming, or a science club if they're into science, anime clubs if they're into anime, is really important. It's not a guarantee of friendships. You also have to have an accepting source of friends, right? They have to be accepting of us. And one of the ways to increase that acceptance is to use some of these skills we're talking about that aren't going to push people away and maybe instead draw them in. But the other part of that too is just going to a meetup group that's for neurodivergent youth, which there's a lot of groups out there that are like just for kids on the spectrum. that's not a guarantee of a friendship either, right? That might be an accepting source of friends because of the common, experience of being neurodivergent, but that doesn't mean they're going to have anything to talk about or anything to do together. So it really has to be both. But interestingly, there's really not differences in what helps people to be socially successful when it comes to making and keeping friends, whether you're typically developing or neurotypical, however you want to describe that, or you're neurodivergent. And that's the good news, I guess, for all of us, is that we don't have to complicate it with all of that. But again, ultimately, I think the final and bottom line is that all of these skills, whether you choose to use them or not, are really a choice. So thank you again for the opportunity to share with your group and also to answer those questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If you found today's event helpful, we encourage you to register for OAR's next webinar event, A Guide to Interpersonal Communication and Conflict for Autistic Teens and Adults, on May the 11th, 2023 at 1 p.m. Eastern. Once you close out of today's event, you will receive an exit survey. We would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. Everyone will receive a follow-up email with a link to today's video recording and materials within the week. On behalf of the Organization for Autism Research, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.